This is just an update to another rambling I had about how possibly the American Indians got here. Say that there was a great ice age, and it was so great that all the snow fell on the poles, and the waters of the ocean were divided around the equator, which left dry ground, thus allowing people to travel in between the two continents, say Africa and Europe, China, Russia, and all that. Now, say that during that time could be 1,000 years before it changed back into a melting, possibly a river system, and which it might have been started as, so anyway, these people walked across and possibly settled in South America, building pyramids and such, just as ancient Egyptians built pyramids for thousands and thousands of years, all up and down the Euphrates and the Nile. Supposedly hundreds of pyramids were built there. Anyway, so some of them walked possibly from the east coast and the west coast of, say, the African and what is considered the the European, whatever that continent is called. They say there's 7 continents, but I don't. There's a small sea or a river between. I don't consider it a broken continent. Anyway, so say they walked there during the Great Ice Age and set up in the jungles, because after the walk across that barren land of just dry ground, no shade on the equator, they would have loved the jungles, the shade of the jungles. So that's where they set up, falling in love with the shade and the water. Even though it's heat, there's water and shade. Now, the other mode of transportation is during, before, or after this great ice age, and there was water in between, but a flood stage, possibly from a prior ice age or that ice age that created large volumes of flood debris to gather at the entrances of large river systems flowing into the Pacific or Atlantic. And this large flood debris could have turned into islands, because nobody's going to break them up like nowadays. They'd go out there and maybe people would gather or whatever. But being that it would be large scale floods from coming out of the ice age, it would be much larger flooding and larger amounts of debris, which would collect along shorelines, and people might not be able to differentiate between this large island or flotilla of flood debris, of which animals could have been caught in. They could have gone there to get firewood. I've talked about how it could have happened before. So they could have gathered on these large islands and lived on them. Now, during another flood, they could have broken away and be in a large island. Maybe it was at night. It was gone. They was in the middle of the ocean, and they just rode it out. Maybe they didn't know how to swim back then. Maybe they did. I don't know. I'm not saying. But so they rode this island to, say, the coast of California, the coast of Mexico, where it's dry land. Now, being that they were on this raft in the middle of the ocean, they could have floated for months. Now, there might have been dead animals. They might have caught fish. Who knows? But it was a disintegrating raft. Only it wasn't a raft. It was a large island, but maybe by the time it had broken up into different rafts. And people, there might have been wars or fights over the people. Who knows how many people were living on these flotillas, if it actually happened. So this flotilla landed on the America's coast, and they took to possibly Mexico. Not saying that these are what made up Mexicans, and the Plains Indians of Americas. They spread across and possibly started to move south into the jungles of down in Mexico. Well, if the tribal society of the jungle that had been there, if they had been there earlier than these flotilla Indians, or the American Indians, as I'll say, then they would have been society of war consolidated people that claimed territory, whereas these Indians were just there freely moving about. So these jungle Indians would have attacked, say, these American Indians, pushing them up to where they are now in the States and Canada and such. And that's the reason you have the Mexicans in the desert where there is nothing really there, which would have caused, they would have just, after a while, being part of tribes that continued to breed and moved and defended the territory of the jungle temples, which would have left them in the middle of the desert, and the American Indians on the plains and in Canada and such. Now, the other form of migration to this side, none of them realizing that they could possibly have landed in another land. They just were there. So the other ones, possibly the Eskimos, were seal hunters that just hopped during the seal season on floating ice. And who knows if they had some form of transportation to hop between ice flows, but then they just ended up, not unbeknownst to them, on the other side. That's just my take on the three possible modes of crossing, three possibly different tribes, not of one tribe coming over here and spreading the whole continent of the Americas and South America and all that. But it could have been three different tribes at three different times in prehistory.